Suspecting the waitress was stealing, the millionaire searched the waitress's bag and was paralyzed upon finding a photo. It was a photo of his beloved who disappeared 21 years ago. Lucas Johnson, a man known for his meticulous control and sharp instincts, was on edge. Lately, small amounts of cash had been disappearing from the register at his upscale restaurant. It wasn't enough to hurt his business empire, but the idea that someone was betraying his trust gnawed at him. Lucas was not the type to let things slide, especially when it came to something as sacred to him as his restaurant. His thoughts kept circling back to one person, Hannah, one of the quieter waitresses. She was polite, never caused trouble, and always seemed to fade into the background. But lately, Lucas had been paying closer attention. Something about her didn't sit right. She moved through the restaurant like a shadow, her head always lowered, her eyes always distant. Lucas watched her from his office window as she cleaned up a table. She was quick, efficient, but there was a certain sadness in her movements, a weight that seemed to press down on her. It wasn't just the missing money that bothered him now, it was the way she carried herself, like she was hiding something much deeper. The more he observed her, the more certain he became. He needed to know what was going on. The missing cash was too much of a coincidence. After another day where the numbers didn't add up, Lucas decided to confront her. As the evening wound down and the last of the customers left, Lucas stood in the doorway of his office and called out to her. "Hannah," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for questions. "I need to see you in my office." She glanced up, her eyes briefly meeting his before she quickly nodded. She finished wiping down the counter, then quietly followed him. Lucas had already rehearsed what he would say, but now, face to face with her, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that he hadn't expected. Once inside his office, Lucas closed the door and motioned for her to stand in front of his desk. He sat down, folding his hands, watching her closely. Hannah stood there, her fingers fidgeting slightly with the strap of her apron. She seemed smaller now, standing in the dim light of the office, almost as if she was trying to make herself invisible. "There's been some money missing from the register," Lucas began, cutting straight to the point. His tone was calm, but the underlying accusation was clear. "And I need to know what's going on." Hannah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. She just stood there, frozen, as if she didn't know how to respond. Lucas leaned forward. "Let me see your bag." Her hands instinctively gripped the strap of her bag, which was hanging loosely over her shoulder. For a moment, it looked like she might refuse, but then, silently, she slipped the bag off her shoulder and handed it to him. Lucas took it and began searching through it methodically. At first, he found nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual things: a wallet, a few personal items, a notebook. But then, tucked into a side pocket, he pulled out something that made his heart stop. It was an old photograph, slightly worn around the edges, but the image was unmistakable. It was a picture of Margaret, his fiancée who had vanished over 2 decades ago, without a trace. She was smiling in the photo, the same carefree smile he remembered. The sight of it sent a wave of emotions crashing over him: shock, confusion, and something deeper, more painful, that he hadn't felt in years. His hands shook slightly as he held up the photo, his eyes locked on it. Then, without looking up, he asked in a low voice, "Where did you get this?" Hannah's eyes flickered with confusion and fear. She instinctively reached out to grab the photo, but Lucas pulled it away, his gaze sharp. "Where did you get this?" he repeated, his voice firmer this time. Hannah blinked, clearly rattled by the intensity in his tone. It's my mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's a picture of my mom." Lucas stared at her, his mind racing. This couldn't be right. His breath caught in his throat as he looked at Hannah, really looked at her this time. The resemblance was undeniable. The same soft eyes, the same delicate features. How had he not noticed it before? "Your mother," he asked, still trying to process what she was saying. "Your mother is Margaret?" Hannah nodded slowly, her brows furrowing. "Yeah. She passed away when I was little. I never really knew her. Why?" Lucas felt the room spin around him. His heart pounded in his chest as realization hit him like a freight train. Hannah wasn't just any employee, she was his daughter. The daughter he never knew existed. The child Margaret must have had after she disappeared. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, guilt, disbelief. But above all, there was a single, burning question. Why had Margaret hidden this from him? Before he could say anything else, he motioned for Hannah to follow him. "Come with me," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "We need to talk." Hannah followed Lucas down the narrow hallway of the restaurant, her heart racing. She didn't understand why he was acting this way, why he seemed so rattled. The way he had looked at that photo, her mother's photo, like it was something more than just an old picture. His eyes, filled with disbelief and a trace of something she couldn't quite name, made her feel uneasy. They reached a small sitting area near the back of the restaurant. It was a quiet space, used mostly by staff during breaks. Lucas stopped and turned to face her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. Finally, Lucas broke the silence. "You said, this woman in the photo is your mother." Hannah nodded cautiously. "Yes, that's Margaret. She died when I was really young. I don't have many memories of her." She looked down at the floor, biting her lip. Talking about her mother always felt strange, like trying to remember something from a dream that slipped away every time she reached for it. Lucas inhaled sharply, as if he'd been punched in the gut. His thoughts raced. Margaret had died. How could that be? And yet, if she had a daughter, that meant Margaret had been pregnant when she disappeared, pregnant with his child. Lucas couldn't shake the flood of emotions, the anger, the regret, the overwhelming sadness that he had been kept in the dark all these years. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing slightly. "You have no idea," he muttered, half to himself. "No idea what this means." Hannah furrowed her brows, clearly confused. "What do you mean? You knew my mother." Lucas stopped pacing and looked at her directly. His expression was unreadable, but there was something deep, raw in his eyes. "Knew her," he repeated. "I didn't just know her. I loved her. Margaret and I were supposed to get married. We were engaged, but she disappeared, just vanished one night. No one ever heard from her again." Hannah's mouth fell open, shock washing over her face. "Wait. What? You were engaged to my mom." Lucas nodded slowly, his mind drifting back to the last time he saw Margaret. It was all coming back now, the argument, the way she left in tears, and how he thought he would never see her again. He'd spent years wondering what had happened to her. He'd convinced himself that she had left because of their fight. But now, standing here with her daughter, everything he thought he knew was crumbling. "I had no idea," Hannah whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt a pit form in her stomach as pieces of her own life started to shift and click into place. All the gaps in her mother's past, the things she never talked about. It suddenly made sense. Margaret had been running from something, or someone. Lucas sighed heavily, his gaze falling to the floor. "I didn't know about you, Hannah. If I had known Margaret was pregnant, I would have..." He cut himself off, unable to finish the sentence. It was too much, too overwhelming. Hannah stared at him, still trying to wrap her head around what she was hearing. She'd grown up without a father, never knowing who he was, never asking too many questions because her mother had always seemed so guarded. Now, this man, her boss, was telling her that he was the one. Her father. How was she supposed to process that? "I don't understand," Hannah said, her voice shaky. "Why didn't she ever tell me? Why didn't she come back to you?" Lucas shook his head, his expression pained. "I don't know. That's what I've been trying to figure out for years. I thought she left because of me, because we had a fight. But now I'm starting to think there's more to it than that." Hannah sank into a nearby chair, her legs feeling too weak to hold her up. This was too much, too fast. Her mother had always been a mystery, a shadow in the background of her life. And now, out of nowhere, she was learning that her father, this man she barely knew, had been searching for answers all this time. Lucas, seeing the confusion and hurt on Hannah's face, softened his tone. He sat down across from her, his voice quieter now. "Look, I know this is a lot to take in. I can't imagine what this must feel like for you, but you have to believe me when I say, I had no idea you existed. If I had, I never would have let you grow up without knowing the truth." Hannah stared at the floor, her mind racing with a million questions. "So, what now?" she asked softly. "What are we supposed to do?" Lucas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. I need to find out what really happened to your mother. I need to know why she left, why she kept you a secret. There's more to this story, Hannah, and we need to figure it out." Hannah looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. How? Where do we even start? Lucas stood up, determination hardening his features. "There's only one place to start," he said firmly. "The house. The place Margaret and I lived before she disappeared. I haven't been back there in years, but maybe there's something there that can give us answers." Hannah hesitated, unsure of how to respond, but deep down, she felt a pull, a need to know the truth, just as much as he did. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's go." Lucas glanced at her, a mixture of relief and determination in his eyes. "Good. We'll leave in the morning." The drive to the old house was long and silent. The morning fog hung low over the winding road, adding an eerie weight to the journey. Hannah sat quietly in the passenger seat, her fingers nervously tapping against the door. She kept glancing at Lucas, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. The tension between them was palpable, though neither knew quite how to break it. For Lucas, the drive stirred memories he had buried long ago. He hadn't been back to that house in over 2 decades. Just thinking about it brought back the flood of emotions he'd worked so hard to suppress. The love he felt for Margaret, the bitterness of their final argument, and the crushing emptiness when she disappeared without a word. His mind drifted back to that night. It had started with a simple disagreement, nothing out of the ordinary. But as the conversation turned to the topic of their future and the unexpected news of Margaret's pregnancy, things had spiraled out of control. Lucas had been overwhelmed with work, caught up in the pressure of building his empire. The timing couldn't have been worse, and he had said things in the heat of the moment that he would regret for the rest of his life. "You can't do this to me now, Margaret. I'm on the verge of something huge. I can't afford distractions," he had shouted, his frustration boiling over. Margaret had stood there, tears in her eyes, as she cradled her stomach protectively. "Distractions," she had whispered, her voice shaking. "This is our child, Lucas. How can you even say that?" Lucas winced at the memory, feeling the weight of his words all over again. That had been the last time he saw her. She had stormed out of the house, and by the time he'd cooled down and gone looking for her, she was gone. No trace, no explanation, just gone. He shook his head, trying to push the memory away, but it clung to him like a shadow. Hannah's voice finally broke the silence. "What was she like? My mom, I mean." Lucas blinked, glancing over at her. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. How could he possibly describe Margaret in a way that would do her justice? She had been everything to him, kind, strong, passionate, and yet all of that had slipped through his fingers. She was incredible, Lucas said slowly, choosing his words carefully. Smart, funny, stubborn as hell. She could hold her own in any argument, and she always fought for what she believed in. He smiled slightly, a rare expression on his usually serious face. We had our differences, sure, but I loved her more than anything. Hannah listened quietly, absorbing every word. This was the first real glimpse she had ever gotten of her mother as a person, not just a distant memory. For so long, her mother had been this figure shrouded in mystery, someone she could only piece together through fragmented stories. Now, hearing Lucas speak, it felt like Margaret was coming to life before her eyes. "Why did you fight?" Hannah asked after a moment, her curiosity getting the better of her. Lucas sighed, his grip tightening on the wheel again. "I was an idiot," he admitted. "I was so focused on my business, on making a name for myself, that I lost sight of what really mattered. When she told me she was pregnant, I didn't react well. I was scared. I thought it would ruin everything I had worked for." He paused, the guilt of those words still heavy on him. "But I was wrong. I should have seen it for what it was, a chance to start a family with the woman I loved. Instead, I pushed her away. And then she was gone." Hannah nodded, her heart aching at the thought. She had never known her mother, but she could imagine the pain Margaret must have felt that night, the loneliness, the fear, and Lucas, left behind, consumed by regret. It was hard to imagine how different her life could have been if things had gone another way. As they approached the old house, Lucas's stomach twisted into knots. The place had been abandoned for years, but it still held a strange pull on him. The memories were etched into every corner, every creak of the floorboards. He parked the car, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "This is it," he said quietly. The house stood at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by overgrown grass and trees that seemed to press in from all sides. The paint was peeling, the windows were clouded with dust, but it was still standing. It looked just like it had the night Margaret walked out the door. Hannah stepped out of the car, staring up at the house with a mixture of awe and apprehension. This was where it had all started, where her parents' love had bloomed and then shattered. She couldn't help but feel a strange sense of connection to the place, even though she had never set foot there before. "Come on," Lucas said, his voice softer now. "Let's see if there's anything here that can help us." They walked up the front steps together, the wood creaking under their weight. Lucas unlocked the door, the rusty hinges groaning as it swung open. The inside of the house was cold and empty, but it was as if the past still lingered in the air, waiting for them to uncover its secrets. As they stepped inside, Lucas felt the weight of everything he had lost pressing down on him. This house had once been filled with love and hope. Now it was just a shell, a reminder of everything that had slipped through his grasp. Hannah looked around, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. "Do you think she ever came back here?" she asked softly. Lucas shook his head. "I don't know, but if she did, maybe there's something here. Something that can tell us why she left and what really happened to her." The air inside the house was thick with dust, and the old wooden floors groaned beneath their feet as Lucas and Hannah walked through the dimly lit rooms. Time had not been kind to the place. Cobwebs draped over the corners, and the once vibrant furniture had dulled to muted shades of gray. But even through the decay, Lucas could see fragments of the life he once shared with Margaret. It was as if time had frozen in the moment she left. Hannah wandered into what used to be the living room, her fingers lightly brushing over the back of an old chair. "This feels strange," she said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Like I'm stepping into someone else's life." Lucas stood in the doorway, watching her. "This was our life," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We had plans. We were supposed to get married, start a family. But everything fell apart." Hannah turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. She wasn't sure how to feel. She had always pictured her mother's past as something distant and untouchable, but now, standing here in the very home where Margaret had once lived, it all felt incredibly real. And knowing that Lucas had been a part of it, knowing that he was supposed to be a part of her life, was overwhelming. They moved through the house in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Lucas couldn't shake the memories that flooded his mind as he walked through the rooms. He remembered the long nights he and Margaret spent talking about their future, the plans they made to turn this house into a home. But all of that had disappeared the night she walked out. "Why didn't you ever come back here?" Hannah asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Lucas stopped in the middle of the hallway, his eyes fixed on the faded wallpaper. "I couldn't," he said simply. "After she disappeared, it was too painful. This house held too many memories. I thought, maybe if I stayed away, it would hurt less." Hannah nodded, though she couldn't fully understand. She had grown up without those memories, without the weight of that loss. But for Lucas, it was clear that this place was more than just a house. It was a monument to everything he had lost. As they entered what used to be the bedroom, Lucas paused. The bed was still there, though the sheets were covered in dust, and the closet doors hung slightly open, revealing empty hangers. Lucas hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and pulling open one of the drawers. It was mostly empty, except for a few small items, an old necklace, a hairbrush, and a few loose papers. Hannah came up behind him, her eyes scanning the contents. "Anything useful?" she asked. Lucas shook his head, but as he was about to close the drawer, something caught his eye. It was a small envelope, tucked into the corner beneath the papers. His breath caught in his throat as he picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The envelope was addressed to him. He tore it open with shaking hands, pulling out a single piece of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Margaret's. His heart pounded in his chest as he began to read. "Lucas, if you're reading this, then it means I couldn't face you. I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you everything, but I couldn't. Not after what happened. You said things that night, things I know you didn't mean, but they hurt. I thought maybe I could stay, that we could work things out. But I was wrong. I need to leave for both of us. There's something I haven't told you, something I was too scared to say. I'm pregnant, Lucas. I found out not long ago, and I didn't know how to tell you. I know how important your career is, how much you've sacrificed, and I didn't want to be the one to take that away from you. But this is our child, and I can't stay. I don't know what's going to happen from here, but I can't let you give up your dreams for me or for our baby. Maybe one day you'll understand. Maybe you'll hate me for leaving, but please know that I never stopped loving you." Margaret Lucas stared at the letter, the words blurring in front of him as tears filled his eyes. She had been pregnant. She had been carrying his child the whole time, and he never knew. He'd spent all these years thinking she had left because of him, because of the argument. But the truth was so much more complicated than he could have imagined. "She was pregnant," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "She left because she thought I didn't want the baby." Hannah's eyes widened. "You mean, she left because of me?" Lucas nodded slowly, still staring at the letter in his hands. "She was trying to protect me. She didn't want to be the reason I gave up my career." Hannah didn't know what to say. She had grown up believing her mother had simply passed away after a quiet life. But now the truth was so much more complicated. Her mother had been running, not just from Lucas, but from the fear of ruining his future. Lucas wiped at his eyes, folding the letter carefully and slipping it into his pocket. "We need to find her," he said, his voice stronger now. "There's more to this. She didn't just disappear. I don't think she wanted to be found." Hannah frowned. "What do you mean?" "I think someone else was involved," Lucas said, the pieces finally starting to come together in his mind. Margaret wouldn't have just vanished without a trace. There's someone, who didn't want us to be together. Hannah felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" Lucas looked at her, his eyes dark with determination. "I'm saying there's more to this story than we thought, and we're going to find out what really happened." The letter had changed everything. For Lucas, it was like a dam had broken. All these years, he had carried the guilt of driving Margaret away, thinking his ambition had ruined everything. Now, he realized she had been trying to protect him, shielding him from the decision she thought would destroy his future. But that decision had destroyed them both in the end. As they drove back from the old house, the weight of the new revelations hung heavily in the air. Hannah stared out of the window, trying to process what she had just learned. She had always felt a certain distance from her mother, even in memory. Margaret had always been a vague figure, someone she could never fully understand. But now, it was as if pieces of her past were beginning to fall into place. "Do you think she ever planned to come back?" Hannah asked quietly, breaking the silence. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if she had come back, I would have been here. I would have been waiting. I didn't know about the pregnancy. About you. I can't imagine how scared she must have been. But I would have done everything to make it right." Hannah nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the letter Lucas had given her to hold. She had read it several times now, and each time, her understanding of her mother deepened. Margaret had been scared, but more than that, she had been conflicted. The love she had for Lucas, mixed with the fear of holding him back, had torn her apart. "But why didn't she come back?" Hannah pressed. "After all these years, she could have found you. She could have told you about me." Lucas sighed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "That's the part that doesn't make sense. There had to be something more. Margaret wouldn't have stayed away for no reason. And if she didn't, I think someone kept her away." Hannah's brow furrowed. "You really think someone else was involved?" Lucas glanced at her, his eyes dark with determination. "There's no other explanation. Margaret was strong-willed, but she wouldn't have just disappeared like that. Someone made sure she couldn't come back, and whoever it was, they've been hiding the truth for years." The car fell into silence again as they both contemplated what this could mean. Hannah's mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Who could have had a motive to keep Margaret away? And why? She had so many questions, and with each passing minute, the need for answers grew stronger. By the time they reached Lucas's home, night had already fallen. The lights of the city glittered in the distance, but inside the car the mood was still heavy. Lucas parked the car and turned off the engine, but neither of them moved to get out. "What do we do now?" Hannah asked, her voice soft but steady. Lucas turned to face her, his expression resolute. "We find her. Wherever she is, we'll find her, and we'll find out the truth about what really happened." Hannah nodded, a mix of fear and hope swirling inside her. For the first time in her life, she had a connection to her past, a father who wanted to know her, a mother who had fought for her in ways she never understood. But that connection came with the weight of so many unanswered questions. She wasn't sure if they would ever find Margaret, but for the first time, she had hope. As they stepped out of the car, Lucas's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was an unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" he said, his voice cautious. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a deep, gravelly voice. "Lucas Johnson?" Lucas stiffened. "Who's asking?" The voice chuckled darkly. "I hear you've been digging into the past. That's dangerous, you know." Lucas's heart skipped a beat. "Who the hell is this?" "Someone who knows things you don't want to know. But since you've started looking, maybe it's time you found out the truth." Lucas's grip on the phone tightened. "What are you talking about?" The voice on the other end hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Meet me tomorrow night, 9 p.m., at the old pier. You'll get your answers, but be careful. Some truths are better left buried." The line went dead before Lucas could respond. Hannah, noticing the tension in Lucas's expression, looked at him with concern. "What was that about?" Lucas slowly lowered the phone, his mind racing. "Someone knows something," he said, his voice low. "They want to meet me tomorrow, at the old pier." Hannah's eyes widened. "Do you think it's connected to Mom?" Lucas nodded grimly. "It has to be. Someone knows what happened to her, and they're ready to talk." "But what if it's dangerous?" Hannah asked, worry creeping into her voice. Lucas met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It might be, but we don't have a choice. We need answers." The next day felt like it stretched on forever. Lucas barely slept, his mind turning over every possible scenario. Who was this mysterious caller? What did they know? And more importantly, could he trust them? As night fell, the air grew colder, and the city streets emptied. Lucas stood by the door, ready to leave, when Hannah appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly. Lucas shook his head. "It's too dangerous. I don't know what we're walking into." Hannah crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "I don't care. This is about our family. I deserve to know the truth too." Lucas hesitated. He didn't want to put her in harm's way, but he couldn't deny that she had every right to be there. After a long moment, he nodded. "Okay, let's go." They drove through the quiet streets, the tension in the car growing with every mile. When they arrived at the pier, the wind was sharp, cutting through the silence. The old docks creaked under their feet as they walked toward the meeting point. Lucas scanned the area, his eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. "Stay close," he whispered to Hannah. Just as they reached the end of the pier, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the dim light of a nearby street lamp. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, his voice the same gravelly tone from the phone call. "I'm glad you came." The man stood there, his face obscured by the low light of the pier's single flickering lamp. Lucas narrowed his eyes, his body tense as he approached, keeping Hannah slightly behind him. He didn't trust this stranger, but something about the situation felt inevitable. This was their only lead. Whoever this man was, he held the answers they had been searching for. "You said you had information," Lucas said, his voice steady, but his nerves clearly on edge. "So talk." The man took a slow breath, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "You've been looking for Margaret," he began, his tone measured, deliberate. "I can tell you where she is." Hannah's breath caught in her throat, and she stepped forward slightly, her eyes wide. Lucas reached out, gently pulling her back, though his heart was pounding just as hard as hers. The idea that after all these years, someone might finally tell him where Margaret had gone. It was almost too much to process. "Where is she?" Lucas demanded, his patience wearing thin. The man tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were sizing Lucas up. "She's alive," he said flatly. "But I'm sure you knew that already, didn't you?" Lucas's eyes flickered, a mix of relief and anger surging through him. Margaret was alive. She hadn't disappeared or died like they had all assumed. But if she was alive, why hadn't she come back? Why had she stayed hidden all this time? "Where is she?" Lucas repeated, his voice rising. The man stepped closer, his face finally becoming clearer. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with deep lines etched into his weathered skin. His eyes were dark and calculating, the kind that had seen too much. "I'll tell you where she is," he said slowly, "but you're not going to like the answer." Lucas clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration mounting. "What the hell are you talking about? Just tell me." The man's lips curled into a slight, humorless smile. "She's in the mountains," he said. "She's been living there for years, but she didn't just disappear on her own. Someone took her." Hannah gasped, and Lucas's eyes widened in shock. "Took her? he repeated, his mind racing. Who? Why? The man glanced around as if checking to make sure they were still alone. Your old business partner, Conrad, he said. He's the one who took her. Lucas felt the ground drop out from under him. Conrad? He repeated, disbelief clear in his voice. Why would Conrad take her? The man's gaze sharpened. He was jealous of you, he said bluntly. Always has been. You were the one with the vision, the drive. He resented your success, and he thought taking Margaret would break you. Lucas's hands clenched into fists, his mind flashing back to the years he and Conrad had worked together. They had built their company from the ground up, but things had always been tense between them. Conrad had been ambitious, sure, but he had never given any indication that he was capable of something like this. Kidnapping Margaret, keeping her hidden for years. How do you know all this? Lucas asked, his voice low, dangerous. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to Hannah for a brief second before returning to Lucas. Because I was there, he said, almost reluctantly. I worked for Conrad at the time. I didn't know what he was planning until it was too late. And when I realized what he had done, I couldn't go to the police. I knew too much. I had no choice but to disappear. Lucas stared at him, his mind spinning. This man had been involved in the conspiracy to take Margaret. He had known where she was all these years. Why are you telling me this now? Lucas demanded, his voice shaking with fury. Why didn't you come forward sooner? The man's expression hardened. Because I didn't have a reason to, he said flatly. But now I'm tired of running. I've lived with this secret for too long, and I'm ready to end it. Lucas was about to say something when Hannah spoke up, her voice trembling. Where is she? She asked again, stepping out from behind Lucas. Where is my mother? The man looked at her, his gaze softening slightly. She's in a cabin in the mountains, he said. I'll give you the location, but you need to understand. Margaret doesn't remember everything. She's been through a lot. Conrad kept her isolated for years. She might not even recognize you at first. Hannah's face paled, but she nodded, her determination unshaken. I don't care, she said firmly. We need to see her. Lucas took a step closer to the man, his eyes burning with intensity. If you're lying about this, I swear. I'm not lying, the man interrupted, his voice cold and steady. I'm telling you the truth. Go to the cabin. You'll find her there. Lucas stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. There was so much to process, so many emotions swirling inside him. Margaret was alive. She had been taken from him. And now, after all these years, they were finally going to find her. Without another word, the man handed Lucas a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. Lucas looked at the address, then back at the man. If this is real, he said quietly, I'll make sure Conrad pays for what he did. The man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the pier, leaving Lucas and Hannah standing there in stunned silence. Hannah looked up at Lucas, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. We're really going to find her, aren't we? She whispered. Lucas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Yes, he said, his voice firm. We're going to find her. The next morning, Lucas and Hannah set out for the mountains. The drive was long, the landscape gradually shifting from the bustling city to the rugged, isolated wilderness. The cabin was far off the beaten path, hidden deep within the trees, just as the man had said. As they approached the cabin, Lucas's stomach tightened with nerves. It was small, almost hidden by the surrounding woods, but it was exactly where the man said it would be. Lucas parked the car, and they stepped out, the silence of the mountains pressing in around them. Hannah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the cabin. Do you think she's really here? She whispered. Lucas didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the front door and knocked, his heart pounding with every second that passed. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. But then, slowly, the door creaked open, and there she was. Margaret. She stood in the doorway, her face pale and gaunt, but unmistakably her. Lucas's breath caught in his throat as he stared at her, unable to speak. Margaret's eyes flicked between Lucas and Hannah, confusion clouding her expression. For a moment, no one moved. Then, finally, Margaret whispered, "Lucas." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Lucas stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at Margaret as if she were a ghost. After all these years, he had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways. But none of those imagined versions had prepared him for the reality of seeing her again. She looked so different, thinner, with lines of exhaustion etched into her face. Her hair, once vibrant, was now streaked with gray, and her eyes held a wariness that had never been there before. But beneath all of that, it was still her. It was still the woman he had loved. "Margaret," he finally managed to say, his voice breaking slightly. He took a step toward her, his heart pounding. "It's really you." Margaret didn't move at first. Her eyes flicked between Lucas and Hannah, confusion knitting her brow. She looked at Hannah for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her face. "Who are you?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Hannah swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. I'm Hannah. I'm your daughter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of separation and lost time. Margaret's face paled even more, her hand gripping the doorframe for support. "My daughter?" she whispered, almost as if she couldn't believe it. "Yes," Hannah said, her voice shaking. "You left, but you had me. I've spent my whole life not knowing why. But I'm here now, and I need to know. I need to know everything." Margaret looked at her, her eyes brimming with tears. She reached out as if to touch Hannah's face, but stopped short, her hand trembling in the air. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know how to find you." Lucas, still standing just behind Hannah, couldn't take his eyes off Margaret. He had so many questions, but the sight of her, fragile and clearly haunted by years of pain, kept him frozen in place. All he could do was wait, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Margaret slowly stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. The cabin was small, just as they had expected, barely furnished, with a simple bed in the corner and a few chairs scattered around. It was clear she had been living in isolation for a long time. The air inside was cold and still, the kind of silence that only came from being alone for too long. Once inside, Margaret gestured for them to sit. Lucas and Hannah took seats at the small table, but Margaret remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said, her voice trembling. "I wanted to come back, I tried, but I couldn't. They wouldn't let me." Lucas leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Who wouldn't let you?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as if summoning the strength to speak. When she opened them again, she looked directly at Lucas. "Conrad," she said, her voice steady now. "It was Conrad. He's the reason I disappeared." Lucas's jaw clenched at the mention of his former business partner. "I know," he said quietly. "Someone told me he took you. But why? Why didn't you ever reach out? Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret lowered her gaze, tears sliding down her cheeks. "He threatened me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After I left that night, after our fight, I was confused, hurt. I didn't know what to do. I needed space to think, so I went to stay with a friend, but Conrad found out. He came to me, told me that if I ever tried to come back, he'd destroy you. He said he would ruin everything you'd worked for. your business, your reputation. He knew things, Lucas. Things that could have taken everything away from you. Lucas felt his fists tighten at his sides. That bastard, he muttered under his breath. His mind raced, trying to comprehend the depth of Conrad's betrayal. He had always known Conrad was ambitious, but this, to take Margaret away, to hold her hostage with threats for years, it was unforgivable. I didn't believe him at first, Margaret continued, her voice thick with emotion. But then he started showing up. He would send me messages, reminding me that he was always watching. I was scared, Lucas. I didn't know what else to do. I thought that by staying away, I was protecting you. Lucas stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You should have told me, he said, his voice filled with anger and frustration. We could have fought him together. I would have protected you, Margaret. I would have done anything. Margaret shook her head, tears still falling. I was trying to protect you, she said softly. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I see how wrong I was. Hannah, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke up, her voice breaking. So all this time, you were alive, and you knew about me. Why didn't you come for me? Why did you let me grow up without you? Margaret's face crumpled in sorrow. I didn't know how, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know where you were. After Conrad took me, he kept me isolated. He told me you were gone, that it was too late. I had no way of finding you. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, unable to process the years of abandonment and pain. I needed you, she said, her voice trembling. All this time I needed you. Margaret took a hesitant step toward her hands shaking. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I thought I was doing what was best, but I was wrong. I was so wrong. Lucas watched the exchange, his heart breaking for both of them. He had always imagined a reunion where everything was explained, where the pieces would fall into place and make sense. But now, standing here, he realized that nothing could erase the years of pain and separation they had all endured. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But one thing was clear. They had found Margaret. She was alive, and now they had a chance, however small, to rebuild what had been lost. We can still make this right, Lucas said, his voice steady but filled with determination. We're together now. And Conrad, he's going to pay for what he did. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. Lucas, he's dangerous. If you go after him. I don't care, Lucas interrupted, his voice hard. He took everything from us, and now it's time he faces the consequences. The drive back from the cabin was heavy with silence. Lucas's mind raced with thoughts of Conrad and the betrayal he had never seen coming. Margaret had been held captive all these years, not physically, but emotionally, trapped by Conrad's threats and manipulation. The thought of it made Lucas's blood boil. He had to act. He had to make sure Conrad paid for what he had done. Next to him, Hannah sat quietly, staring out of the window. She had been through so much in the past few days, uncovering a past she never knew existed and reuniting with a mother she thought was lost forever. But instead of feeling relief, there was an undeniable sense of anger building inside her. How could her mother have let this happen? How could she have let Conrad win? I don't understand why she didn't fight harder, Hannah said softly, more to herself than to Lucas. Lucas glanced at her, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Margaret did what she thought was right. She was scared. Conrad had a lot of power back then. He knew things about me, about the business, that could have destroyed everything. She was trying to protect us. Hannah shook her head, frustration evident on her face. But what about me? Didn't she think about what it would be like for me to grow up without a mother? Didn't she care? Lucas sighed, his heart heavy. He didn't have the answer she was looking for. He knew Margaret had been in an impossible situation. But he also understood Hannah's pain. She cared, Hannah. I know she did. But fear can make people do things they wouldn't normally do. It makes you think you're doing the right thing when, in reality, you're just running. Hannah didn't respond. Her eyes focused on the road ahead. She wanted to believe Lucas, but the years of hurt were hard to let go of. It was difficult to reconcile the image of her mother, someone she had idolized in her absence, with the reality of what had happened. But now, more than anything, Hannah wanted answers. She wanted to understand why everything had fallen apart. As they approached the city, Lucas's phone buzzed in the center console. He glanced at the screen, and his heart skipped a beat. It was an unfamiliar number, just like the call from the man who had sent them to the cabin. Lucas hesitated for a moment, then picked it up and answered. "Lucas Johnson," he said, his voice cautious. "Lucas," the voice on the other end replied, low and gravelly. It was the same man from before. "You found her, didn't you?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "Yes, I did. And now I need to know everything. Why did Conrad do this? Why did he take her?" There was a brief silence on the other end before the man spoke again. "It wasn't just about jealousy. There was more to it than that." Lucas frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "What are you talking about?" The man's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Conrad had a plan. Taking Margaret was just part of it. But there's something you don't know. Something Margaret doesn't even know." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" "Margaret was never supposed to stay gone forever," the man continued. "Conrad didn't just want to ruin your life. He wanted to take over everything, your business, your family, and the way he saw it, the best way to do that was to make sure Margaret was out of the picture. Temporarily." Lucas's heart raced. "What do you mean, temporarily?" The man hesitated again before speaking. "Conrad didn't just take Margaret. He planned to bring her back. After he had gained enough power in the company, after he had made sure there was no way you could fight him, he was going to make her come back. Only this time, she wouldn't be the same. He'd break her down, make her dependent on him. She'd think you were the one who abandoned her." Lucas felt sick. The idea that Conrad had orchestrated all of this, that he had planned to manipulate not just him, but also Margaret, was almost too much to bear. "Why?" Lucas demanded, his voice rising. "Why would he go to such lengths?" The man's voice turned cold. "Because he loved her. Conrad was obsessed with Margaret. He always was, even when you two were together. He couldn't stand the thought of her being with you. So, he set out to destroy you and take her for himself. But when she got pregnant, everything changed. His plan fell apart, and he had to improvise. That's when he made her disappear for good." Lucas's mind reeled with the weight of the revelation. Conrad had been in love with Margaret the whole time, and everything, the kidnapping, the threats, the years of separation, had been part of some twisted plan to make her his. "He's a monster," Lucas muttered under his breath. The man on the other end of the phone sighed. "You're not wrong, but you need to be careful. Conrad's dangerous, and now that you're getting close to the truth, he won't hesitate to stop you." Lucas clenched his teeth, his anger rising. "I don't care. He's going to pay for what he did to her, to all of us." "There's more," the man added, his voice lowering. "Conrad isn't working alone. He's got people in the company, people you don't even know about, who are helping him keep control. If you're going after him, you need to be smart. You can't trust anyone." Lucas's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Tell me everything. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." The man hesitated one last time. "Meet me tomorrow, same place as before. I'll give you the full story. But be careful, Lucas. Conrad's not going to let this go without a fight." The call ended abruptly, leaving Lucas staring at the phone, his mind spinning. He turned to Hannah, who had been listening to his side of the conversation with growing concern. "What was that about?" she asked, her voice filled with worry. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Conrad," he said quietly. "It's worse than we thought. He didn't just want to ruin me, he wanted to take everything. And now we're getting close to the truth." Hannah's eyes widened. "What are we going to do?" Lucas looked at her, his expression hardening with determination. "We're going to finish this, once and for all." The next day came quickly, and Lucas felt the weight of what was to come pressing heavily on him. He and Hannah prepared to meet the mysterious informant again, knowing that this time, the stakes were even higher. Conrad had gone to unimaginable lengths to destroy their lives, but now Lucas had the chance to take everything back. As they drove to the meeting point, Lucas couldn't help but think about Margaret. She was safe now, back in the cabin, but the scars of what had happened would never fully heal. He owed it to her, and to Hannah, to end this nightmare and make Conrad pay for what he had done. When they arrived at the pier, the air was thick with anticipation. The same gravelly-voiced man stood waiting for them in the shadows, his posture tense. Lucas and Hannah approached cautiously, ready for whatever came next. But as they stepped closer, a sudden realization hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. Something was wrong. The man's expression wasn't just tense, it was terrified. "You're too late," the man said, his voice trembling. "Conrad knows. He's coming for you." Lucas's pulse quickened as the man's words sunk in. "Conrad knows," he had said, his voice trembling with fear. Hannah gripped Lucas's arm, her eyes wide with anxiety. For a moment, neither of them moved, their minds racing to process the implications. If Conrad knew they were close to uncovering the truth, it meant only one thing: they were in real danger. Lucas straightened, his body tense and ready for action. "What do you mean he's coming for us?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The man stepped back slightly, casting a nervous glance over his shoulder. "Conrad has eyes everywhere," he said in a low voice. "I thought I could get you the information before he figured it out, but he's ahead of us. He knows you found Margaret. He knows you're looking for answers, and now he's moving fast. If you don't act now, he'll make sure you disappear, just like he did with Margaret." Lucas's fists clenched at his sides, anger rising inside him like a wave. He had waited too long for this moment, too long to see justice served. Conrad had stolen everything from him, his future, his family, and now he was threatening to take even more. "Where is he?" Lucas asked, his voice hard as steel. "Where is Conrad?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Lucas and Hannah. "I don't know exactly. He's been keeping a low profile ever since you started poking around. But if I had to guess, he's at the estate. That's where he's always had his most loyal people. They'll protect him. It's like a fortress." Lucas's jaw tightened. The estate. Of course, Conrad had always used that place as a symbol of his power, his wealth. But now it was more than that. It was a hiding place, a sanctuary where he could continue his schemes without fear of being caught. But Lucas wasn't going to let him get away this time. "We're going to the estate," Lucas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Hannah's grip tightened on his arm. "Are you sure? What if it's a trap?" Lucas met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. He knew the risks. He knew that confronting Conrad on his own turf was dangerous, but he had no choice. "We don't have a choice in Hannah," he said quietly. "He's not going to stop until we make him. If we don't end this now, he'll come after us. After you. After Margaret." Hannah swallowed hard, her fear evident, but she nodded. She knew Lucas was right. Conrad wasn't just a threat, they were running out of time. The man handed Lucas a set of coordinates and a key card. "This will get you through the outer gates, but once you're inside, you're on your own. Conrad has guards. They'll be armed." Lucas took the key card, his face set in grim determination. "We'll be ready." The drive to the estate was tense and silent, the weight of what was to come hanging heavily in the air. Lucas kept his focus on the road, but his mind was racing with 1,000 possibilities. What would he find when they got there? How many people would Conrad have waiting for them? And most importantly, how was he going to protect Hannah in the middle of what was sure to be a dangerous confrontation? Hannah sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She was scared, more scared than she had ever been in her life, but she refused to show it. She had spent so many years wondering about her past, longing for answers. And now that she was on the brink of discovering the full truth, she wasn't about to back down. She had to see this through, no matter what. As they approached the estate, Lucas slowed the car, his eyes scanning the massive gates that loomed ahead. It was a sprawling property, surrounded by high walls and thick trees, designed to keep intruders out and secrets in. The security was tight, but Lucas had the key card. He pulled up to the gate, swiped the card, and waited as the gate slowly creaked open. "This is it," Lucas muttered, his eyes narrowing. He drove through the gates, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The estate stretched out before them, a vast expanse of manicured lawns and towering trees, with the main house looming in the distance like a fortress. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. And Lucas could feel the tension building with every step they took closer to the house. As they parked and stepped out of the car, Lucas turned to Hannah, his expression serious. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, don't leave my side." Hannah nodded, her fear barely contained. She followed him as they made their way toward the entrance of the house, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The front door was locked, but Lucas wasn't surprised. He knew Conrad would have the place locked down. He glanced around, looking for another way in, and spotted a side door leading to the servants' quarters. He motioned for Hannah to follow, and they slipped through the side entrance, entering the dark, quiet hallway. They moved through the house cautiously, the tension growing with every step. The air was thick with the sense that something was about to happen, and Lucas's instincts were on high alert. He knew Conrad was here, somewhere, watching them, waiting. As they reached the main foyer, they heard a noise, footsteps. Lucas froze, motioning for Hannah to stay behind him. The sound grew louder, closer, until a figure appeared at the top of the grand staircase. It was Conrad. He stood there, looking down at them with a smug smile on his face, as if he had been expecting them all along. His eyes were cold, calculating, and Lucas could feel the weight of his presence like a dark cloud. Well, Conrad said, his voice smooth and taunting. "I have to admit, Lucas, I didn't think you'd come this far, but I suppose I underestimated your stubbornness." Lucas's jaw clenched, his anger simmering just below the surface. "It's over, Conrad. We know everything. You can't hide anymore." Conrad chuckled, taking a slow step down the stairs. "Hide? Oh, Lucas, I think you're mistaken. I'm not hiding. I'm right here, exactly where I've always been. And you, well, you're just as predictable as ever. Always so quick to charge in without thinking." Lucas took a step forward, his fists clenched. "You ruined my life, Conrad. You took Margaret from me. You kept her hidden for years, manipulating her, threatening her. And for what? Because you were jealous? Because you wanted to take everything I had?" Conrad's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Jealous? Oh, Lucas, you really don't understand, do you? This was never about jealousy. This was about power, control. You had something I wanted, and I took it. Simple as that." Hannah stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "You didn't just take him. You took my mother. You destroyed our family." Conrad's gaze shifted to Hannah, and for a brief moment, his expression softened. "Ah, the daughter. I wondered when you'd show up. You know, Hannah, your mother never stopped thinking about you, even when she was with me." Lucas felt a surge of rage. "Shut up," he growled. "You have no right to talk about her." Conrad's smile widened. "Oh, but I do, Lucas, because I'm the one who's still in control here. You see, I've got people watching, waiting for my signal. One wrong move, and everything you care about will be gone. Just like that. Lucas stared at him, his mind racing. Conrad had always been 2 steps ahead, always one move away from total destruction. But Lucas wasn't going to let him win this time. "You're wrong, Conrad," Lucas said, his voice steady. "This time, you're the one who's lost." Lucas's words hung in the air, a challenge that cut through the tension like a blade. Conrad stood frozen for a moment, his smug smile faltering as he took in Lucas's defiant stance. The weight of years of manipulation, deception, and destruction pressed down on the room. But for the first time, Conrad's control seemed to waver. "You think you've won, Lucas?" Conrad sneered, taking another step down the staircase. "You think you can walk into my house, throw around accusations, and everything will magically fall into place?" Lucas didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Conrad. "I don't think I've won. I know I have. Your game is over." Behind him, Hannah stood tense, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the energy in the room shift. Something was about to break. Her father had faced down Conrad, exposed the lies that had kept their family apart for so long, and yet, standing there in the cold, grand foyer of the estate, the stakes felt higher than ever. Conrad's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. "This was never just about taking Margaret from you. This was about making sure you would never have anything. I wanted to watch you fall apart, piece by piece, while I stood by and took everything." Lucas's fists tightened at his sides. The rage he'd held back for so long now dangerously close to boiling over. "You took everything from me," he growled. "You kept Margaret away from her family. You made her live in fear. You stole years from us, years we'll never get back." Conrad's eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction. "And I'd do it all again," he said, "because I enjoyed watching you suffer, knowing there was nothing you could do to stop me." Lucas took a step forward, but Hannah quickly moved to stand beside him, placing a hand on his arm. She could feel the anger radiating from him, and she knew that Conrad was trying to provoke him, to push him over the edge. "Don't," Hannah whispered urgently. "He's not worth it." Conrad's eyes flickered to Hannah, his expression shifting slightly as he regarded her. "You know, Hannah, you're more like me than you realize. Strong, determined. I bet if things had gone differently, you would have been proud to call me a mentor." Hannah recoiled, her face contorting in disgust. "You're nothing like me," she spat. "I'll never be anything like you." Conrad's smile wavered, but he quickly recovered, shrugging nonchalantly. "Suit yourself," he said. "But remember, no matter what you think, no matter how hard you try, you'll never undo what's been done. Your family will always carry the scars I left behind." Lucas couldn't take it anymore. He stepped forward, his voice low and filled with menace. "This is your last chance, Conrad. Walk away now, and maybe you'll get out of this with something. But if you keep pushing, you'll lose everything." Conrad's laugh echoed through the room, cold and hollow. "You don't scare me, Lucas. You never did." But just as the words left his mouth, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the house. Lucas and Hannah both turned toward the noise, their bodies tensing in anticipation. Conrad's expression changed. He looked suddenly uneasy. The footsteps grew louder, and then, from the shadows, a group of men appeared. They were dressed in black, clearly armed, and their faces were set in hard, determined lines. They marched forward with precision, stopping a few feet behind Conrad. Lucas's heart sank. This was Conrad's final play, his last-ditch effort to maintain control. He had called in reinforcements, hired muscle to intimidate them, to end this confrontation on his terms. "I told you, Lucas," Conrad said smugly. "You'll never win. I always have the upper hand." Hannah's breath hitched in her throat as she looked at the men standing behind Conrad. This was bad, worse than she had imagined. They were outnumbered, and Conrad was clearly ready to escalate things. She glanced at Lucas, searching his face for some kind of plan. But then something happened that none of them had expected. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. He eyed Conrad with disdain before speaking in a low, commanding voice. "You're done, Conrad." Conrad blinked, his face twisting in confusion. "What?" The man crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "We've been watching you for a long time, waiting for you to slip up. And now that you have, it's over." Conrad's eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about? I hired you." The man shook his head. "Not anymore. You're under arrest." Before Conrad could react, two of the men stepped forward, pulling his arms behind his back and slapping handcuffs on his wrists. Conrad struggled, his face turning red with rage and disbelief. "What is this?" he shouted. "You can't do this. I'm in control here." But the men ignored him, dragging him down the stairs as he continued to yell. "This isn't over, Lucas!" Conrad screamed, his voice echoing through the hall. "I'll destroy you. I'll destroy everything you love." Lucas stood still, his chest heaving with adrenaline as he watched Conrad being taken away. Hannah's hand tightened on his arm, and she looked up at him with wide eyes. "What just happened?" she whispered. Lucas exhaled slowly, his body finally relaxing as the weight of everything began to lift. "I don't know," he admitted. "But it looks like someone's been keeping an eye on Conrad." The leader of the group turned to face Lucas and Hannah, his expression calm and professional. "We've been investigating Conrad for a long time," he explained. "He's been involved in illegal activity for years. Blackmail, extortion, you name it. We've had enough evidence to take him down, but we needed to catch him in the act. Your investigation into Margaret's disappearance was the final piece we needed." Hannah's mouth fell open in shock. "So, you knew?" The man nodded. "We've been monitoring him closely. When we saw that he was making moves against you and your family, we knew it was time to act." Lucas felt a rush of relief flood through him. After all these years, after everything Conrad had done, justice was finally being served. The monster that had torn his life apart was finally being held accountable. "Thank you," Lucas said, his voice filled with gratitude. The man nodded once more. "We'll make sure Conrad never hurts anyone again." With that, the group escorted Conrad out of the house, his shouts of anger fading into the distance. Lucas and Hannah stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. "It's over," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's really over." Lucas turned to her, a mixture of relief and sadness in his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly, "it's over." The days that followed Conrad's arrest felt surreal. For so long, Lucas had lived under the weight of what Conrad had done, the constant shadow of betrayal and loss hanging over him. Now, with Conrad finally gone, that shadow had lifted. But even with Conrad out of their lives, there was still a sense of unresolved emotion lingering in the air, particularly for Margaret, who had been through so much, and for Hannah, who was still trying to process the reunion with her mother. Lucas stood on the balcony of his home, staring out at the city skyline as the early morning light began to filter through the buildings. He hadn't slept much in the days since Conrad's downfall, his mind constantly racing with everything that had happened. He thought of Margaret, safe now but still healing from the years of manipulation. He thought of Hannah, who had been through so much more than any daughter should have to endure. And then there was the future. For the first time in years, Lucas allowed himself to think about what came next. The chaos had ended, but rebuilding their lives wouldn't be easy. As he stood there lost in thought, he heard footsteps approaching behind him. Turning, he saw Hannah standing in the doorway, wrapped in a sweater to shield herself from the crisp morning air. "Hey," she said softly, stepping onto the balcony beside him. "Hey," Lucas replied, offering her a small smile. "How are you feeling?" Hannah shrugged, leaning against the railing and looking out at the horizon. "I don't know," she admitted. "It still doesn't feel real, you know? Everything happened so fast." Lucas nodded. "Yeah, it's a lot to take in." They stood in silence for a while, the quiet between them comfortable but heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Hannah turned to face him, her brow furrowed slightly. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "We move forward," he said. "We take things one step at a time. We have a lot of healing to do, especially your mom. But we're together now. That's what matters." Hannah looked down at her hands, her expression troubled. "Do you think she'll ever be okay? After everything?" Lucas sighed, leaning his elbows on the railing as he looked out over the city. "I think it's going to take time," he said honestly. "She's been through a lot, but she's strong, and she has us. We'll help her through it." Hannah nodded, though she still looked uncertain. I don't know how to feel about her. I spent my whole life wondering about her, missing her, and now that she's back, it's like I don't know who she is anymore." Lucas understood. He had felt the same way in many ways. The Margaret they had found wasn't the same woman who had left all those years ago. She had been changed by her experiences, molded by the fear and isolation Conrad had inflicted on her. But beneath all of that, she was still Margaret, the woman he had loved. "It's going to take time to get to know her again," Lucas said gently. "But I believe that underneath everything, she's still the same person. She's still your mom, and I know she loves you." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I just wish she had come back sooner. I wish she had fought harder." Lucas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We can't change the past," he said softly, "but we can decide what to do with the future. And I think, given the chance, she'll fight for you now. She's here. That's what matters." Hannah nodded, her gaze softening. "You're right," she said quietly. "It's just hard to let go of all the years we lost." Lucas didn't have an answer for that. He knew the pain of lost time all too well, but he also knew that dwelling on the past wouldn't help them move forward. They had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild, to heal, to find some semblance of peace, and that was what they needed to focus on now. Later that afternoon, Lucas and Hannah drove out to the cabin to visit Margaret. She had been staying there ever since Conrad's arrest, taking the time she needed to recover emotionally and physically from everything she had endured. It was a quiet place, peaceful and removed from the chaos of the city. And Lucas thought it was exactly what she needed. As they approached the cabin, Lucas noticed how much calmer Margaret seemed. She was still fragile, still carrying the weight of the past, but there was a lightness to her now that hadn't been there before. Margaret greeted them at the door, her face softening into a small smile when she saw them. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice quieter than it had been in the past. Hannah offered a hesitant smile in return, though Lucas could sense the nervousness still lingering beneath the surface. This was still new for both of them, trying to rebuild their relationship after so many years of separation. They sat together in the small living room, the atmosphere light but slightly awkward. Conversation flowed slowly at first, but after a while, they began to talk more freely. Margaret opened up about her time in hiding, sharing the small moments of hope she had clung to over the years. She spoke of the guilt she had felt for not coming back sooner, and how Conrad had manipulated her into believing she was doing the right thing by staying away. "I didn't know what else to do," Margaret admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you both, but I see now that I was just running, and I'm so sorry for that." Hannah reached out, placing her hand on Margaret's. "I understand," she said softly. "I don't blame you. I'm glad you're here now." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed Hannah's hand tightly. "I'm going to make it up to you," she whispered. "I promise. I'm going to be the mother you deserve." Lucas watched the exchange, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. They had been through hell, but they were finally coming out on the other side. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the cabin, Lucas stood by the window, watching the light dance across the trees. He had spent so many years focused on the past, on what he had lost, but now, standing here with the two people who mattered most to him, he realized that the future was what mattered now. Margaret and Hannah were here. They were together, and they had a chance to start again. A new beginning.